I was halfway through my usual Saturday morning ritual, a strong black coffee in hand, the faint scent of rain lingering outside, and a newspaper I barely read. The small cafe on the corner had always been my refuge, a place where the world slowed down just enough for me to think. That's when she walked in. Nicole. I recognized her immediately, though it had been months since our paths last crossed. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She simply stood there, hands clutching her coat a little too tightly, eyes fixed somewhere between me and the door, as if gathering courage from the space around her. I set my cup down, not wanting to rush her, letting the silence fill the distance between us. She moved toward my table, tentative but deliberate. There was a weight in her expression I hadn't seen before, a quiet urgency that made me straighten up without even. She sat, smoothing her coat over her lap as if she could shield herself from the moment she was about to create. Then she looked at me, really looked, and said the words, "I'm expecting a child, yours." The cafe seemed to shrink around us. The low hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the faint hiss of the espresso machine, all of it receded until it was just us, sitting in a bubble of something unspoken and immense. My first instinct was to measure her seriousness, to search for some hidden meaning, some sign that this was a joke, a test, a misstep, but there was none. Her eyes, wide, anxious, vulnerable, told me everything I needed to know. This was real. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. My voice, when it came, was steady, calm, deliberate. "Then I become a father, and your eternal protector." The words hung between us like a promise, a bridge being built in the silence of the moment. Nicole's lips parted slightly, a tremor passing through her jaw, as if she were trying to articulate something she couldn't yet form. I reached out, placing a hand over hers, careful not to force anything, simply offering presence. She didn't pull away. That small, tentative gesture felt monumental. We sat like that for a while, not speaking, listening instead, to the muted world outside, to the quiet of our own breaths, to the new reality we hadn't chosen, but that had chosen us. There was a fragility in her posture, a fear of abandonment, a hesitance I could feel radiating, but there was also a quiet relief. Perhaps she hadn't expected me to respond with calm, with certainty, with unwavering presence. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows in a slow, insistent rhythm. Nicole's gaze drifted toward the glass, tracing the rivulets as if they could wash away her fears, or maybe they were a mirror. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence says more than words, and in that silence, I let her know she wasn't alone. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed suspended. I could sense her heartbeat quicken, then slow, settling into a fragile rhythm that mirrored my own. She was letting herself hope, carefully, warily, like one might peek around a corner into sunlight after a long tunnel. I gave her nothing but the steadiness of my own presence. I didn't promise love, or a perfect life, or grand gestures. I promised only what mattered, that she wouldn't face this alone, that we would face it together, step by step, decision by decision. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. I didn't know who else to tell. I was scared. I squeezed her hand gently. "You chose me. That's enough for now. We'll figure the rest out." And just like that, something subtle and irrevocable shifted. The world outside continued its noise, but inside that small cafe, for that brief, infinite moment, a new story had quietly begun. I kept replaying her words in my mind long after she left the cafe. The phrase, simple and devastating in its clarity, had settled into my thoughts like a quiet echo. "I'm expecting a child, yours." I didn't feel panic, not the kind that twists the stomach or makes the world tilt. I felt a gravity, a responsibility that was sudden and undeniable, yet strangely natural. I knew I had to understand how we had arrived here, how this fragile, unexpected life had formed between us months ago, without either of us fully realizing it. Our first encounter had been brief and unremarkable to anyone else. I remembered it now in vivid fragments. The late evening rain, the dim light of the bookstore, where she had wandered aimlessly among shelves, searching for something she didn't yet know she needed. I was there as well, lingering over a display of old journals, pretending to browse while actually watching her from across the aisle. She had seemed fragile even then, carrying a kind of quiet solitude that made her stand out in a room full of strangers. I had approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her, and we had talked, not about anything dramatic, nothing that would later be worthy of storybooks. We spoke of literature, the mundane grievances of work, the way rain sounded on rooftops. Our conversation flowed naturally, but it carried an intimacy of its own, a small, unspoken recognition, a fleeting trust granted without words. By the time we parted, I had felt a rare, gentle connection, something I didn't often encounter and rarely understood. I hadn't thought of her for months, not because I wanted to forget, but because life tends to demand attention in other directions. Until now. Nicole's voice in that cafe reopened a chapter I hadn't realized was still alive, her presence reminding me that some connections refuse to dissipate with time. I wondered about her life in the intervening months, the silent moments she had endured, the decisions she had made, and I felt the first stirrings of a protective instinct that was almost immediate, as if some part of me had been waiting for this very responsibility. I knew she had a reason for coming to me now, a reason deeper than circumstance. There was no dramatics in her approach, no accusations, no recriminations, just urgency, vulnerability, and the quiet hope that someone might stand beside her. I understood that hope instantly. I had always believed that the most powerful gestures are often silent, a hand offered, a presence maintained, a choice made without need for persuasion. I could give that. I would give that. That evening, after she left, I found myself wandering the city streets, letting the cold air wash over me as I reflected. I was not a man given to grand declarations or impulsive choices, but something about this situation demanded clarity and calm. I traced the path of the previous months in my mind, imagining her alone in her apartment, her fears, the weight of the unknown pressing on. I thought of the baby she carried, an unintentional creation of a night neither of us had fully expected, and I understood, without a moment's hesitation, that I would not let her face it alone. When I returned home, I didn't make a plan. I didn't write lists or plot conversations. I simply sat, considering the gravity of a promise I had already made without uttering a word. I would be there. I would be steadfast. And in the quiet, I allowed myself to imagine her smiling freely, to imagine her letting down the walls she had carried for so long. That possibility, fragile and tentative as it was, anchored me in a way I hadn't anticipated, and so I waited, not anxiously, not impatiently. I simply waited, knowing that tomorrow, or the next time we spoke, I would begin to translate presence into action, choice into protection, and intention into the quiet, steady beginnings of a life we had never planned, but one we could now choose together. I met Nicole the following morning at the small park near her apartment. She had insisted on walking, saying it helped her think, though I suspected it was a way to avoid the walls of her own space for a. I didn't rush her, nor did I fill the air with idle conversation. Instead, I walked beside her, maintaining a rhythm that allowed her to speak if she wanted, or not. I had long learned that sometimes presence alone speaks louder than words. The city moved around us in a blur of commotion, but inside our little bubble, time seemed suspended. I noticed the way she avoided looking at the other parents with strollers, the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the zipper of her coat. I resisted the urge to tell her it would be okay, to soothe her fears with assurances. She needed to discover that on her own, with me beside her, a steady presence, not a rescuer. When she finally spoke, it was about something trivial, a street musician playing a violin off-key, a dog barking in the distance. But I listened as if her words were a lifeline. I realized then that this was more than conversation. It was trust being built, brick by quiet. I didn't interject with advice or anecdotes. I let her have the space to speak and to think, offering only the occasional nod or small smile to anchor her in reality, in safety. At some point, we found a bench by the fountain. She sat, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I remained standing nearby, hands in pockets, posture relaxed yet unwavering. She glanced up at me, almost hesitant, and then spoke the words that revealed more than she intended. I'm afraid, Patrick, afraid I'll mess this up, that I'll be alone, that. Her voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, as if saying it aloud might make it true. I stepped closer, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. You're not alone, I said simply. Not now, not ever, if I can help it. That's a choice I've made, and it's steady. You don't have to wonder about it, or earn it. I'm here. The relief that passed over her face was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A line softened around her eyes, her posture eased, and for the first time in months, I sensed a fragile but genuine calm. We didn't speak again for some time, letting the fountain's water, the rustling leaves, and the distant sounds of the city fill the silence between us. It was a companionable silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty but protective. I realized how rare this feeling was. Two people sharing the same space without demands, without expectations, simply existing with one another. By the time we began walking again, the sun had shifted, casting golden streaks across the pavement. I suggested we stop for a coffee, but she shook her head, smiling faintly. Not yet, she said. I think I needed this quiet. I nodded, understanding. We didn't need words to define what had shifted. The walk, the silence, the mere act of being together was enough. As we parted, I gave her hand a brief, firm squeeze. She didn't pull away. Something unspoken passed between us. A promise of consistency, of presence, of steady protection without suffocation. And for the first time, I sensed that she truly believed it. The invitation was simple: my apartment, coffee, maybe a quiet corner for her to rest. She hesitated at first, lingering in the doorway as if unsure whether to cross the threshold into my space, into a life she hadn't yet imagined sharing with. I didn't rush her. I simply gestured toward the couch, where a soft blanket lay folded, and left her to decide. After a moment, she sat, letting the weight of her coat fall away, revealing the exhaustion she'd carried in silence. I poured the coffee slowly, deliberately, listening to the hum of the machine and the faint drip from the kettle. The air was warm, scented with the subtle mix of roasted beans and the lingering aroma of rain from outside. She wrapped her hands around the cup, seeking warmth, comfort, a tether to something safe. I sat across from her, leaning back slightly, observing her without intruding. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloging details, but they always returned to me, searching for some reassurance she didn't yet know how to ask for. We began talking, at first cautiously, about trivial things. A book she had just started, a song that wouldn't leave her head, the way sunlight fell across the city streets. Then slowly, she opened up about her childhood, her fears, the subtle pressures of family expectations she hadn't anticipated. I listened, letting her words spill, never interrupting, never judging. I offered nothing but my steady attention and the occasional question that invited her to go deeper if she chose. She hesitated when speaking of the night we'd shared months ago, the memory flickering across her expression and of shame and nostalgia. I didn't mean for it to happen like, she admitted softly. I didn't respond with excuses or apology. I simply nodded. It did happen, and it matters now because you're here, and we're facing it together, I said. The words were calm, measured, unshakable, and I could see the tension in her shoulders begin to loosen, just slightly. Hours passed unnoticed. We shared stories, laughter, and silences that were comfortable, the kind that felt like home even if only for a few fleeting hours. I noticed her gaze lingering on small detail, the stack of books I'd left on the shelf, the way the light hit the walls, the quiet steadiness of my presence. She didn't speak of fear anymore. It had softened, replaced by a tentative curiosity, an almost imperceptible sense of relief that someone had chosen to be unwavering in her corner. At one point, she draped the blanket over her shoulders, and I didn't offer words of comfort. She didn't need them. The simple act of sharing warmth in silence was enough. I watched her relax, the walls she carried for so long beginning to crumble, not with force, but gently, naturally, as if gravity itself had shifted to allow it. By the time she stood to leave, the daylight had softened to gold, casting long shadows across the apartment. She paused at the door, looking back at me, and I gave her the faintest smile, the kind that said, "I will be, always." Without a word, she nodded, carrying with her a quiet hope I had seen emerge in her eyes, a hope she had finally allowed herself to feel. The rhythm of our days began to settle into something quiet and predictable. I didn't insist on schedules or grand gestures. I offered simple, steady presence. She accepted, hesitantly at first, the small touches of consistency that gradually built a scaffold of trust. I found myself showing up at her apartment unannounced sometimes, bringing coffee or a pastry she liked, or a book I thought might distract her mind for a while. She never asked me to come, and I never forced my way in. I just offered, and each time she accepted, the space between us narrowed without the need for words. There were appointments to accompany her too, mundane yet important, doctor visits, errands that required strength she didn't yet feel she had alone. I never spoke of duty or obligation, only of willingness, letting my actions be the reassurance rather than empty phrases. I noticed her subtle reactions, how she relaxed slightly when I held the door, how her grip on the railing loosened when I walked beside her. She was slowly learning that she didn't need to perform, to earn my presence. It was simply the constant and unwavering. One afternoon, she paused during a walk to catch her breath and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You don't seem impatient," she said, voice soft, almost afraid that complimenting it would shatter the calm. I smiled lightly. "Patience isn't about waiting," I told her. "It's about being present when it matters. And right now, this matters." She studied me for a long moment, as if deciding whether I was being sincere. Then she nodded, a small, quiet gesture that held more weight than 100 spoken promises. Evenings were the easiest. Sometimes we sat in silence, she on the couch, me in an armchair, reading or watching the rain tap against the window. Occasionally, she would speak, quietly, about things she hadn't shared with anyone else, fears of failing, of being alone, of not being enough. I never offered judgment, only reassurance through presence. Sometimes, that meant speaking. Sometimes, simply sharing the space was enough. The trust we were building was fragile, but it was growing, layer by invisible layer. There were moments when her walls flickered and returned, a glance over her shoulder, a tightness in her chest, a hesitation in speech. I never pressed, never demanded explanation. I only stayed. The act of remaining, day after day, became our quiet rhythm. She began to rely on the predictability of my steadiness. And with that, her anxiety started to soften, almost imperceptibly. One rainy evening, I brought over a blanket I knew she liked, draping it across her shoulders without a word. She looked up at me, a faint smile appearing despite the storm outside. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. I shook my head. "I choose to. Always." That night, as I walked home, I realized how subtly our lives had begun to intertwine, not through dramatic gestures or declarations, but through the quiet accumulation of small, unwavering acts. Nicole's mother had called that evening. I heard the tension in her voice even before the conversation began, the way she tightened her grip on the phone, her knuckles whitening, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for an invisible blow. I remained in the living room, sitting quietly, observing her from across the space, knowing that this was one of those moments when she needed presence more than words. The conversation was brief but loaded. Her mother's subtle, cutting comments hinted at judgment, at the possibility of abandonment, at the unspoken fear that Nicole would be left to navigate the future alone. When she hung up, Nicole sank onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with the tremors of suppressed anxiety. I didn't ask her to explain, didn't demand the torrent of her emotions to be poured out. I simply approached, sitting beside her, letting my presence anchor the room. "You're not alone," I said softly, reaching out to cover her trembling hands with mine. The simplicity of the gesture seemed to speak louder than any words I could have offered. She finally looked up, eyes red-rimmed and glistening. I don't know if I can do this, if I'll ever be enough, or if anyone will stay," she admitted, voice small, fragile, laced with fear. I took a moment before answering, measuring my words carefully, knowing that in this delicate space, certainty mattered more than emotion. "I've already chosen," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay, step by step, with you. Not because it's convenient, but because you and this child matter. We'll figure out the rest together." She remained quiet, processing, letting the words sink in. I didn't try to push her, didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, I simply stayed, the stillness between us heavy. In time, her hands relaxed slightly within mine, her posture softened, and a faint breath of relief escaped her. I knew she had not just heard me, but felt the weight of my decision to be steadfast, a choice I made without hesitation or expectation of reciprocity. Later, when the room had quieted, she spoke in a softer tone, almost to herself. "I didn't expect anyone to choose me, not like this." I held her gaze, unwavering. "I chose you," I said, "and I choose again every day. You won't need to wonder if you're alone anymore." She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning slightly toward me, a silent acknowledgement that she believed, finally, that she could rely on someone without fear. We spent the remainder of the evening in quiet company. I sat near her, not speaking, letting the small sound of our synchronized breathing fill the space. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, the rain a soft percussion against the glass. Inside, something subtle had shifted, her defenses lowering, her trust beginning to form. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it was tempered, softened by the certainty of my choice. She had learned that my presence was not fleeting, that my steadiness was not conditional, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax without shame. By the time the night had deepened, I sensed a fragile serenity settle around her, a quiet hope that perhaps this chapter of her life would not be faced in isolation. I didn't speak further. Words were no longer necessary. The silence carried the promise. Nicole hesitated at the apartment door, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag as if it were a lifeline. I had suggested she stay near me for a while, at least until she felt steadier, but I didn't press. I had learned that presence matters more than persuasion. I watched her, patient and calm, waiting for her to make the decision herself. "I don't know if I can leave my apartment, my routines," she admitted softly, eyes tracing the floor. "Everything feels so fragile right." I nodded, understanding that she wasn't speaking of furniture or walls, but of the fragile construct of her life, the way she had held herself together despite fear, doubt, and uncertainty. "You don't have to make this permanent," I said, my voice steady. "This isn't about forcing you into a decision. It's about giving you the space to choose, and knowing that whatever you decide, I'll be here." Her gaze lifted, meeting mine, searching for something between reassurance and commitment. I didn't need to promise perfection. I only offered what I could sustain: presence, patience, and protection. "I've already made my choice," I said simply. "I'm staying. Not because I expect you to, but because I've chosen to be here. If you decide to stay close, that's your choice. If not, that's yours too. But know that I won't leave." She swallowed, a shiver running through her as though the weight of the possibility finally reached her. "I'm scared," she whispered. Of making the wrong choice. Of failing. Of being alone again. I reached out, letting my hand cover hers in a quiet, firm gesture. Fear is part of this, I said, but you won't face it alone. That's something I can guarantee. Not through words alone, but through every day we share, step by step. We walked through the small park outside, letting the late afternoon sun trace gold across the paths. Her pace was slow, deliberate, testing the decision she had yet to fully commit to. I stayed beside her, silent, steady, a shadow that moved with her rather than ahead or behind. I felt the weight of trust beginning to settle between us, delicate and new, yet already resilient enough to hold something far larger than either of. When she finally nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, it felt monumental. The decision wasn't about moving in or changing everything at once. It was about letting someone in, about allowing herself to be chosen and to choose in return. I didn't comment. I simply mirrored her movement with a faint, affirming smile. The air between us carried a quiet promise, a beginning without fanfare, a commitment born in calm, not urgency. By the time we returned to her apartment, the sun had dipped low, painting the city in soft amber tones. She paused at her door, glanced at me, and the relief in her eyes was palpable. The first real choice had been made, not just for the practicalities of proximity, but for the emotional terrain she had long feared to navigate alone. Living together, even temporarily, was less about grand gestures and more about the small, almost invisible threads we wove through daily life. I didn't insist on routines or schedules. I simply shared the space with her in a way that made presence feel natural, not imposed. Mornings began with quiet coffee on the balcony, her hand brushing against mine occasionally, each touch light but affirming. She seemed to notice details she had ignored before, the way I folded laundry, the careful placement of dishes, the soft hum of music I kept on low for no one but her. We spent afternoons preparing the apartment for the baby. The tasks were ordinary: washing tiny clothes, assembling a crib, arranging toys in neat rows. Yet these mundane acts carried immense meaning. Nicole watched me organize the shelves, her expression a mixture of wonder and hesitation, as if trying to grasp the idea that someone could care so methodically, so consistently. You make this feel normal, she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I simply smiled. Normal is just a frame we give to the things that matter, I said. She looked down, nodding, as if my words had offered a glimpse of stability she had longed for but rarely found. Evenings were quieter, punctuated by simple acts. I would read aloud from a book she loved, watching her eyes follow the words, occasionally glancing up at me, a silent question in her gaze. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, letting the quiet fill the room like a cushion between us. I noticed how her posture loosened, her breath slowed, and a tentative sense of ease began to settle into her presence. Small smiles appeared unbidden, laughter, once hesitant, now surfaced during shared glances or minor frustrations over misplaced items. We began speaking of the future cautiously, not about declarations or promises, but about choices, the names she liked for the baby, the colors for the nursery, the rhythm of days we could manage together. Every conversation was measured, patient, allowing her to lead where she felt comfortable, and me to support without overstepping. I never pressed. I simply maintained consistency, showing her through actions that trust grows in quiet increments, not through dramatic proof. Sometimes, she would pause mid-task and look at me, a vulnerability in her expression that needed no explanation. I would nod or smile lightly, silently conveying, I am here, I am steady, you are chosen. And she would relax again, continuing whatever she was doing, comforted by the certainty of my presence. Night fell one evening as she finished folding tiny clothes. She leaned back against the couch, exhausted, and I draped a blanket across her shoulders. Thank you, she murmured, her voice soft, almost afraid to claim the comfort. I shook my head. No thanks necessary. You deserve this. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in that glance, the quiet construction of trust, safety, and belonging felt complete. Step by step, day by day, we were building more than a nursery. We were building the foundation for a life she no longer faced alone. The afternoon had softened into a muted gold, sunlight spilling across the living room in lazy beams that fell on the scattered remnants of a day we had spent quietly preparing the nursery. Nicole was perched on the edge of the couch, a small smile flickering across her face as she folded tiny socks with meticulous care. I sat on the armchair opposite, reading a book but aware of her every movement, attuned to the subtle shifts in her expression, the way she held herself, the hesitations that belied her calm exterior. At one point, she looked up, catching my gaze. Our eyes held for longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement passing between us, delicate but profound. The moment carried a weight neither of us had named yet, a fragile connection, intimate in its simplicity, tethered not to desire but to recognition, to trust, to the understanding that we were building something together that mattered beyond immediate impulses. She leaned slightly forward, and I noticed the faint quiver of anticipation in her chest, mirrored by a tightening in my own. For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. I moved slightly closer, careful not to intrude, letting my presence speak instead of my words. Our faces were inches apart, breaths mingling faintly, and I could see the quiet conflict, the desire for closeness, the fear of vulnerability, the weight of past disappointments that lingered ghosts. I didn't close the distance. I let it hover, a near kiss that never needed to be completed, a promise articulated in restraint. "You don't have to feel anything you're not ready to," I whispered, my voice steady, soft. "I've already chosen. That doesn't require anything from you but trust." Her shoulders relaxed fractionally, the tension in her jaw easing. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I think I'm starting to believe that," she admitted, voice trembling slightly. I offered her my hand, which she took without hesitation, a quiet gesture of acceptance, of mutual understanding. I didn't need to fill the space with promises I could not keep. Presence, steadiness, and choice had already done the work words might have undone. The remainder of the afternoon passed in calm routine. We hung a small mobile above the crib, laughing softly at our clumsy attempts to center it perfectly. We arranged blankets and stuffed animals, our hands occasionally brushing, creating small sparks of intimacy that carried none of the urgency of romance but the weight of something deeper. It was in these acts, so simple yet so deliberate, that trust solidified. When evening fell, Nicole sat quietly beside me, leaning gently against my shoulder. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone conveyed acknowledgement of the bond we had forged, careful, respectful, deliberate, and irreversible in its quiet power. I rested my hand lightly on the comfort of choice and commitment settling between us without fanfare, a promise that the foundation of our connection was not fleeting, but enduring. The day of the first ultrasound arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. Nicole had insisted on going together, and I didn't argue. I stayed beside her, hand resting lightly on, offering steadiness rather than words. Her grip was firm, but beneath it, I could feel the lingering tremor of anticipation and fear. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper, a clinical contrast to the warmth of the moment we were about to share. We sat in the waiting room, side by side, silence stretching comfortably between us. I noticed the way she fiddled with the edge of her sleeve, a nervous habit she seemed unaware of, and I offered a small, reassuring squeeze of her hand. She looked at me, eyes searching mine for some unspoken guarantee, and I simply nodded. That gesture, simple and silent, seemed to ease a fraction of her anxiety. "We'll see together," I said quietly, not as a question, but as a declaration. The ultrasound technician called us in, and we followed in tandem, our movements synchronized without discussion. Nicole lay back on the examination table, her hand finding mine instinctively. The monitor flickered to life, black and white shapes forming on the screen. The first heartbeat was unmistakable, a steady, tiny rhythm, persistent and alive. Nicole gasped softly, and I could feel her exhale against my hand. I let her take the first moment to absorb it, to let the reality sink in without interruption. "This is your baby," the technician said, voice neutral but warm. I glanced at Nicole, watching her expression shift from apprehension to wonder. A quiet awe that softened the lines of worry etched across her face. Her eyes met mine, glistening with emotion she didn't attempt to hide. "You hear it?" I whispered, leaning slightly closer. She nodded, a small, fragile smile breaking through. "I hear it," she said, voice trembling but filled with something stronger than fear. "I can't believe it. It's real." I squeezed her hand gently. "It's real," I affirmed, "and I'm here. We'll face it together, every step of the way. No dramatic declarations, no grand promises, just a quiet truth that I would remain steadfast, patient, and present." She leaned against me, her forehead resting lightly on my shoulder, and I felt a calm certainty settle over us. The room, the monitor, the world beyond it, all of it receded into insignificance. There was only the heartbeat, the fragile life before us, and the connection we had quietly nurtured over weeks of presence, choice, and trust. As we left the clinic, the afternoon light softened the streets, painting everything in gentle hues. Nicole walked beside me, not clinging but confident in our shared rhythm. I knew the story was far from complete, that the future held unknowns and decisions yet to come. But in that moment, hand in hand, I realized that something profound had a life, a bond, a quiet promise of continuity that neither time nor circumstance could undo. We didn't need words to affirm it. The slow, steady beats of a tiny heart had said it all.